Hi there, and welcome back to the Cory Doctorow podcast. I'm Cory Doctorow, and I'm just back from Oslo, Norway, where I attended the Fagdagen at the Norwegian Public Broadcaster, who are some of the neatest copy-fighting broadcasters in the world. They've got their own BitTorrent server from which they serve Creative Commons licensed programming that they've purchased on the with a national fee, with tax fee, basically. In contrast to other public service broadcasters who take your money, produce media, but then don't let you share it or remix it. And I had such a good time that I'm actually going back to Oslo. For those of you who I had the happy opportunity to meet there, I'll see you again September 14th and 15th. Just cemented those dates down with my Norwegian publisher. They're going to bring me out for the Norwegian launch of Little Brother. It's actually been a great week for Little Brother. The Spanish bought the rights to Little Brother. There's going to be a Spanish edition through the entire Spanish-speaking world, including Latin America, and I'm planning, although date to be determined, at least a visit to Spain, possibly some Latin American travel as well. I have conversational Spanish, so that should be a lot of fun. And although the details, I don't have them exactly to hand yet. There is a play based on Little Brother launching in Chicago, opening on June the 18th and closing on July the 18th. And there's a pretty good chance that on July the 9th or so, I'm actually going to come through Chicago for a day on my way to something else and be able to catch it, which will be also great. So yeah, everything's been lovely around here. Got a new computer, a ThinkPad X200, which is a beautiful, beautiful machine. Lenovo makes great hardware. The actual purchase process was unbelievably painful, and I would advise everyone to stay away from actually buying your machines directly from Lenovo. You get a better deal if you buy them from a e-commerce provider anyway. I wanted to get a US keyboard with my British machine, so I ended up going straight through Lenovo, which was a huge mistake, just a complete disaster. But the machine itself is great, awesome hardware. Very fast, very clean, and Lenovo or Ubuntu Linux went on without any trouble at all. I retired the old System 76 machine after not very many months. This was the all open source one. It worked really well, but the engineering wasn't great. The fit and finish on the engineering wasn't great. Every time I picked it up, it ejected the DVD drive because the DVD eject button was right under your hand. It had really bad speakers. It ran very hot, and the fan was really, really loud. And after 6 months or so of that, I just couldn't hack it anymore, and I went back and went back to the ThinkPad. I'm really, really becoming a huge fan of the ThinkPad. I think this is my fifth one, and I like them more than ever. Um, so that's it. That's all the news that's fit to print about this week. I'm going to read you again from Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. Excuse me, my 2005 novel from Tor Books. And without further ado, here we go. The snow stopped by 3 p.m., and the sun came out and melted it away, so that by the time the game started at 5:30, its only remnant was the soggy ground around the bleachers with the new grass growing out of the ragged brown memory of last summer's lawn. Alan took the little ones for dinner at the diner after school, letting them order double chocolate chip pancakes. At 13, they'd settled into fatness that made him think of a foam rubber toy, the rolls and dimples at their wrists and elbows and knees like the seams on a doll. "You're starting high school next year?" Alan said, as they were pouring syrup on their second helping. He was startled by this. How had they gotten so old so quickly? "Uh-huh," Ellie said. "I guess. So you're graduating from elementary school this spring?" "Yeah," Ellie grinned a chocolate smile at him. "It's no big deal. There's a party, though." "Where?" "Some kid's house." "It's okay," Alan said. "We can celebrate at home. Don't let them get to you." "We can't go?" Ed suddenly looked a little panicked. "You're invited?" He blurted it out and then wished he hadn't. "Of course we're invited," Fred said from inside Ed's throat. "There's going to be dancing." "You can dance?" Alan asked. "We can," Ed said. "We learned in gym," Greg said, with the softest, proudest voice deep within them. "Well," Alan said. He didn't know what to say. High school, dancing, invited to parties. No one had invited him to parties when he'd graduated from elementary school, and he'd been too busy with the little ones to go in any event. He felt a little jealous, but mostly proud. "Want a milkshake?" he asked, mentally totting up the cash in his pocket and thinking that he should send Brad to dicker with the assayer again soon. "No, thank you," Ed said. "We're watching our weight." Alan laughed, then saw they weren't joking and tried to turn it into a cough, but it was too late. Their shy chocolate smile turned into a rubber-lipped pout. The game started bang on time at 6 p.m., just as the sun was setting. The diamond lights flicked on with an audible click and made a spot of glare that cast out the twilight. Benny was already on the mound, and he'd been warming up with the catcher, tossing them in fast and exuberant and confident and controlled. He looked good on the mound. The ump called the start, and the batter stepped up to the plate, and Benny struck him out in 3 pitches, and the little ones went nuts, cheering their brother on along with the other fans in the bleachers, a crowd as big as any you'd ever see outside of school, 30 or 40 people. The second batter stepped up, and Benny pitched a strike, another strike, and then a wild pitch that nearly beamed the batter in the head. The catcher cocked his mask quizzically, and Benny kicked the dirt and windmilled his arm a little and shook his head. He tossed another wild one, this one coming in so low that it practically rolled across the plate. His teammates were standing up in their box now, watching them carefully. "Stop kidding around," Alan heard one of them say. "Just strike him out." Benny smiled, spat, caught the ball, and shrugged his shoulders. He wound up, made ready to pitch, and then dropped the ball and fell to his knees, crying out as though he'd been struck. Alan grabbed the little one's hands and pushed onto the diamond before Benny's knees hit the ground. He caught up with Benny as he keeled over sideways, bringing his knees up to his chest, eyes open and staring and empty. Alan caught his head and cradled it on his lap and was dimly aware that a crowd had formed around them. He felt Barry's heart thundering in his chest, and his arms were stuck straight out to his sides, one hand in his pitcher's glove, the other clenched tightly around the ball. "It's a seizure," someone said from the crowd. "Is he an epileptic? It's a seizure." Someone tried to prise Alan's fingers from around Barry's head, and he grunted and hissed at them, and they withdrew. "Barry," Alan said, looking into Barry's face, that faraway look in his eyes, a million miles away. Alan knew he'd seen it before, but not in years. The eyes came back into focus, closed, opened. "Davy's back," Barry said. Alan's skin went cold, and he realized that he was squeezing at Barry's head like a melon. He relaxed his grip and helped him to his feet, got Barry's arm around his shoulders, and helped him off the diamond. "You okay?" one of the players asked as they walked past him, but Barry didn't answer. The little ones were walking beside them now, clutching Barry's hand, and as they turned their back on the town as a family and walked toward the mountain. George had come to visit him once before, not long after Alan had moved to Toronto. He couldn't come without bringing down Elliot and Ferdinand, of course, but it was George's idea to visit. That was clear from the moment they rang the bell of the slightly grotty apartment he'd moved into in the annex, near the students who were barely older than him, but seemed to belong to a different species. They were 16 by then, and as fat as house cats, with the same sense of grace and inertia in their swinging bellies and wobbling chins. Alan welcomed them in. Edward was wearing a pair of wool trousers that pulled up nearly to his nipples and short suspenders that were taut over his sweat-stained white shirt. He was grinning fleshily, his hair damp with sweat and curled with the humidity. He opened his mouth, and George's voice emerged. "This place is—" He stood with his mouth open while inside him George thought, "Incredible! I'd never—" He closed his mouth, then opened it again. "Dreamed! What a—" Now Ed spoke. "Jesus, figure out what you're going to say before you say it, will you? This is just plain—" "Rude," came Fede's voice from deep inside his mouth. "I'm sorry," came George's voice. Ed was working on his suspenders, then unbuttoning his shirt, then dropping his pants, so he stood in his grimy jockeys with his slick, tight, hairy belly before Alan. He tipped himself over, and then Alan was face to face with Freddie, who was wearing a t-shirt and a pair of boxer shorts with blue and white stripes. Freddie was scowling comically, and Alan hid a grin behind his hand. Freddie tipped to one side, and there was George, short and delicately formed and pale as a frozen French fry. He grabbed Freddie's hips like handles and scrambled out of him, springing into the air and coming down on the balls of his feet, holding his soccer-ball-sized gut over his hulk underoos. "It's incredible," he hooted, dancing from one foot to the other. "It's brilliant. God, I'm never, ever going home." Oh, yes, Alan said, not bothering to hide his smile as Frederick and George separated and righted themselves. And where will you sleep then? Here, he said, running around the tiny apartment, opening the fridge and the stove and the toaster oven, flushing the toilet, turning on the shower faucets. Sorry, Alan called as he ran by. No vacancies at the Hotel Anders. Then I won't sleep, he cried on his next pass. I'll play all night and all day in the streets. I'll knock on every door on every street and introduce myself to every person and learn their stories and read their books and meet their kids and pet their dogs. You're bonkers, Alan said, using the word that the lunch lady back at the school had used when chastising them for tearing around the cafeteria. Easy for you to say, Greg said, skidding to a stop before him. Easy for you to say, you're here, you got away, you don't have to deal with Davy. He closed his mouth and his hand went to his lips. Alan was still young and had a penchant for the dramatic, so he went around to the kitchen and pulled a bottle of vodka out of the freezer and banged it back down on the counter, pouring out 4 shots. He tossed back his shot and returned the bottle to the freezer. George followed suit and choked and nearly turned purple, but managed to keep his expression neutral. Fred and Ed each took a sip, then set their drinks down with a sour face. How's home? Alan said quietly, sliding back to sit on the minuscule counter surface in his kitchenette. It's okay, Ed mumbled, perching on the arm of the Goodwill sofa that came with the apartment. Without his brothers within him, he moved sprightly and lightly. It's fine, Fred said, looking out the window at the street below, craning his neck to see Bloor Street and the kids smoking out front of the Brunswick house. It's awful, Greg said, and pulled himself back up on the counter with them, and I'm not going back. The older brothers looked balefully at him, then mutely appealed to Alan. This was new. Since infancy, Earl, Frank, Jeff had acted with complete unity of will. When they were in the first grade, Alan had wondered if they were really just one person in 3 parts. That was how close their agreements were. Brian left last week, Greg said, and drummed his heels on the grease-streaked cabinet doors. Didn't say a word to any of us, just left. He comes and goes like that all the time, sometimes for weeks. Craig was halfway around the world, he was in Toronto, and Brian was God knew where. That left just Ed, Fred, George, and Davy alone in the cave. No wonder they were here on his doorstep. What's he doing? He just sits there and watches us, but that's enough. We're almost finished with school. He dropped his chin to his chest. I thought we could finish here, find a job, a place to live. He blushed furiously. Find a girl. Ed and Fred were staring at their laps. Alan tried to picture the logistics, but he couldn't, not really. There was no scenario in which he could see his brothers carrying on with... Don't be an idiot, Ed said. He sounded surprisingly bitter. He was usually a cheerful person, or at least a fat and smiling person. Alan realized for the first time that the two weren't equivalent. George jutted his chin toward the sofa and his brothers. They don't know what they want to do. They think that 'cause it'll be hard to live here, they should hide out in the cave forever. Alan, talk to him, Fred said. He's nuts. Look, George said, you're gone. You're all gone. The king under the mountain now is Davy. If we stay there, we'll end up his slaves or his victims. Let him keep it. There's a whole world out here we can live in. I don't see any reason to let my handicap keep me down. It's not a handicap, Edward said patiently. It's just how we are. We're not like the rest of them. Neither is Alan, George said, and here he is in the big city, living with them, working, meeting people, out of the mountain. Alan's more like them than he is like us, Frederick said. We're not like them. We can't pass for them. Alan's jaw hung slack. Handicap? Passing? Like them? Not like them? He'd never thought of his brothers that way. They were just his brothers, just his family. They could communicate with the outside world. They were people, different, but the same. You're just as good as they are, he said, and that shut them up. They all regarded him as if waiting for him to go on. He didn't know what to say. Were they really? Was he better? What are we, Alan? Edward said it, but Frederick and George mouthed the words after he'd said them. You're my brothers, he said. I want to see the city, George said. You two can come with me, or you can meet me when I come back. You can't go out without us, Frederick said. What if we get hungry? You mean, what if I don't come back, right? No, Frederick said, his face turning red. Well, how hungry are you going to get in a couple hours? You're just worried that I'm going to wander off and not come home. Fall into a hole, meet a girl, get drunk, and then you won't ever be able to eat again. He was pacing again. Ed and Fred looked imploringly at Alan. Why don't we all go together, Alan said. We'll go out and do something fun. How about ice skating? Skating, George said. Jesus, I didn't ride a bus for 30 hours just to go skating. Edward said, I want to sleep. Frederick said, I want dinner. Perfect, Alan thought. Perfect, he said. Perfect. We'll all be equally displeased with this then. The skating's out front of City Hall. There are lots of people there. We can take the subway down. We'll have dinner afterward on Queen Street, then turn in early and maybe get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow we'll negotiate something else. Maybe Chinatown and the zoo. They all stared at him. This is a limited time offer, Alan said. I had other plans tonight, you know. Going once, going twice. Let's go, George said. He went and took his brother's hands. Let's go, okay? They had a really good time. George's body was propped up at the foot of the bed. He was white and wrinkled as a big toe in a bathtub, skin pulled tight in his face so that his hairline and eyebrows and cheeks seemed raised and surprised. Alan smelled him now, a stink like a mouse dead between the gyprock and the walls, the worst smell imaginable. He felt Mimi breathing beside him, her chest heaving against his back. He reached out and pushed aside the wings, moving them by their translucent membranes, fingers brushing the tiny fingerlets at the wingtips, recognizing in their touch some evolutionary connection with his own hands. George toppled over as Alan stepped off the bed, moving in the twilight of the light from under the bathroom door. Mimi came off the bed on the other side and hit the overhead light switch, turning the room as bright as an icebox, making Alan squint painfully. She closed the blinds quickly, then went to the door and shut the chain, and the deadbolt closed. Mimi looked down at him. Ugly sumbitch, whoever he was. My brother, Alan said. Oh, she said. She went back around the bed and sat on the edge, facing the wall. Sorry. She crossed her leg and jiggled her foot, making the spring squeak. Alan wasn't listening. He knelt down and touched George's cheek. The skin was soft and spongy, porous and saturated, cold. His fingertips came away with shed white flakes of translucent skin clinging to them. Davy, Alan said, are you in here? Mimi's foot stilled. They both listened intently. There were nighttime sounds in the motel, distant muffled TVs and car engines and fucking, but no sound of papery skin thudding on the ground down carpet. He must have come out through the drain, Alan said, in the bathroom. The broad pale moon of George's belly was braided in long gray stripes. He stood and, wiping his hand on his bare thigh, reached for the bathroom doorknob. The door swung open, revealing the sanitized for your protection brightness of the bathroom. The water sloshed on the floor by Mimi earlier, the heaps of damp towels. How'd he find us here? Mimi, in her outsized blazer and track pants, touched him on his bare shoulder. He suddenly felt terribly naked. He backed out of the bathroom, shoving Mimi aside, and numbly pulled on his jeans and a shapeless sweatshirt that smelled of Mimi and had long curly hairs lurking in the fabric that stuck to his face like cobwebs. He jammed his feet into the sneakers. He realized that he'd have to step over his brother's body 6 times to do this. He looked at his brother again. He couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The abraded belly, the rictus, his balls shrunk to an albino walnut, his cock shriveled up into unrecognizability, the hair, curly, matted all over his body, patchily rubbed away. He paced in the little run beside the bed, the only pacing room he had that didn't require stepping over George's body, back and forth 2 paces, turn, 2 paces, turn. I'm going to cover him up, Mimi said. Good, fine, Alan said. Are you going to be okay? Yes, fine, Alan said. Are you freaking out? Alan didn't say anything. George looked an awful lot like Davy had the day they killed him.